Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to r/MaliciousCompliance, where people on purpose follow orders to spite others. And in today's episode, students are maliciously complying and getting back at power-tripping teachers and principals. And one OP goes the mile to get a nasty, nasty principal fired. So yeah, sit back, relax, and enjoy the lineup today, guys. Let's dive in. Back when I was in my last year of high school, it was very important that you physically attend class. Back then, I also happened to have severe major depression and a sister who wasn't good at getting organized or getting ready to leave on time. We had a useless teacher at my school who I always despised. The guy would often spend 70-minute periods writing on the board for us to copy down, just cycling back, erasing, and writing continuously. No questions allowed until the last 10 minutes. He was also notorious for not listening to students. He had an unspoken rule that he would lock students out of the class for 5 to 10 minutes when they were late. Let's call him Mr. Richard for obvious reason. Well, one morning, I was 5 minutes late to his class due to my sister throwing a tantrum. I knocked on the door and Mr. Richard said, "Was the bus late?" Apparently, his only valid excuse for running late to class. I responded, "No, but..." He then says, "Well, you can't come in." He then shuts the door in my face. Well, after almost bursting into tears, I decided that his unspoken rule of being left outside the classroom for 5 minutes when late never actually stated that we were required to wait outside the door. So I wander off to the library to find something interesting to read. Apparently, after he opened the door and found me missing, the school had to call my parents to explain they misplaced me and why. I was eventually found, and Mr. Richard had the nerve to ask in front of my parents and the principal why I, A, hadn't told him the reason I was late, to which I responded, "Because you didn't let me say so," and B, why I didn't wait outside the door, which again I responded, "Because you didn't say so, and I wasn't going to waste my valuable learning time that my parents pay for standing and staring at a door." So with that, my parents ripped him a new one, and Mr. Richard didn't lock anyone out of his classroom for at least the next 7 years, so my younger brother tells me. It gave me great pleasure to get one up on such a hard-headed, infuriating teacher. Yeah, I can only imagine the satisfaction OP felt when the teacher just had to sit there with OP's parents yelling at him. But what logic, right? You're already late, so I'm just gonna punish you by making you more late to my class. The top comment of this post says, "I hate such rigid thinkers. How about this, Mr. A-hole? How about instead of assuming that the only reason a student could be late is because they're a worthless F-up that needs to be shamed and humiliated, that maybe you keep them after class and hear their explanation first? There are so many justifiable reasons to be late. I was late once because I witnessed an automobile accident on the way to school and I stopped to help. Should I have been punished for that? Another time, when my dog got hit by a car and killed. How much humiliation did I deserve for that? And while we're on the topic of teachers punishing kids for being late, this person shares a short story and they say, "I went to a Catholic school and we took a religion course every year. My senior year, our teacher, who we'll call Patty, was the absolute worst. She was brand new and she basically hated anyone who wasn't extremely Catholic. Every morning, we had morning prayer, Pledge of Allegiance, and announcements before the official start of class. Patty would purposely close the classroom doors and lock them. So anyone who came in after prayer started would have to stand in the hallway until morning announcements are over. On this particular morning, my friend Brandon was speaking to a teacher before first period. He made it right at the bell, but Patty had locked the doors. Prayer began, and one of our classmates sneaks over to the door to let Brandon in. We thought all was well until announcements ended, and that's when Patty starts screaming at us to tell her who was late. None of us dared to say a peep. Well, Patty gets angrier and she screams and says, "If you don't tell me who walked in during prayer, you will all go get late slips from the principal." And this is when our entire class of about 20 kids looked at each other, and we decided to comply to teach her a lesson because we were so sick of her BS. We all walked downstairs to the main office where the principal and the vice principal's offices were. Our vice principal took one look at us and he said, "What are you all doing here?" We told him that Patty sent us there to get late slips because we let Brandon in during prayer. We said Patty considers that late and none of us wanted to snitch. Plus, Brandon was on time to school and he would have been in the classroom had Patty not locked the doors before the bell. He paused and looked at us for a bit and then chuckled and said, "Get back to class." Needless to say, that was Patty's first and last year teaching there. When I was a freshman in college, I had a math teacher who was very strict about how she taught and how she expected us to learn. For example, she would force students to take notes, and if they didn't, she would make them leave. During our midterm exam, somebody asked how much time was left, and she said 5 minutes. At this point, I was only about halfway done with the test, so I rushed and I finished it barely in time. Me and most of the other students delivered the test and we left the room. When I checked my phone though, I realized there was another 20 minutes left. The students who hadn't finished in time told me that after we left, she realized that she read the clock wrong and she gave them another 20 minutes that me and the others didn't have. I've always been pretty good at math, but obviously, after rushing half the test, I didn't get a good grade. The part I didn't rush was perfect though. The next class, after showing us our results, she said that we need to develop a strategy to improve our grades. She said if we created a plan, stuck to it, and provided evidence of us doing it, she would give us some extra credit. What she expected us to do was say something like, "I'll practice every week," and submit pictures of us doing it as evidence or something like that. Now, while I didn't blame her for reading the clock wrong, I did blame the fact that I thought I only had 5 minutes left for not doing well on that test. I was confident that I could have gotten a perfect grade on it if I had the extra 20 minutes. And so, what I said I would do is bring a watch to the next exam. Was it an arrogant thing to say? Yes. But I also thought it was stupid to follow along with her plan to micromanage our studies. She got mad at me and she said if I didn't do anything else, I would fail the final for sure. But I assured her that the watch was enough for me to do better. A few months later, on the day of the final, I submitted a picture of a watch on my wrist as my evidence for sticking with the strategy. I got a perfect grade on the final. Since my strategy for improving my grades worked, she had to give me extra credit, but not before arguing that I didn't deserve it, of course. Thank goodness OP aced that test because we all know that teacher would not have let that go, right? But what an entitled teacher that was. Couldn't admit her mistake, but instead wants to gaslight students into thinking they need to take on additional study efforts. And for those who may be wondering why there were no clocks in the classroom, it's actually quite common, according to the comments. This person says, "I had a teacher in college that removed the clocks from her classroom. Her reasoning was that she didn't want people watching the clock and not paying attention to her." This next post, OP gets a nasty principal fired. Listen to this one. So this is gonna be a bit of a long one. I've been sitting on this story for years and only recently discovered this sub to finally tell it. This happened when I was in the 8th grade, and I still feel a sense of pride remembering this incident. I went to a small private school that was a part of a network of international schools around the US. This network had its own board of education that managed many things across the schools, including the firing and hiring of principals. Our school principal had decided to leave for another school in the middle of the school year, and the board director for our state decides to take over as the interim principal until a full-time one could properly be found. She was expected to stay as long as a school year or two. And the thing is, many students hated her. She immediately began lording her position on the school board over other teachers, and she was incredibly condescending to all the students, even the high school students, and treating us like we were all little kids. She'll be called Mary for this story. A bit about me is I've always had a problem being picked on by a group of girls in our year ever since we were in 6th grade. They whispered insults to me in class, spread rumors about me, tripped me in the hall, tried to turn the rest of our class against me, and then made fun of me even more for having less friends. I have Asperger's, which had been undiagnosed at the time, and they took advantage of my more literal thinking to trick me into believing stupid things to get me hurt. Because of that, I became incredibly depressed. Towards the end of 8th grade, I decided that I had enough of these girls. And since I was switching to another, more elite school for high school, I felt, even though I was going to be better off than them, it would be proper for me to stand up to these girls once and for all. I didn't have the confidence to go up to them on my own, so I went to a few other girls who I knew this group had been bullying too, to ask if we could all go stand up to them together. So we planned out exactly what we were going to say, and we went to them during lunch to tell them to leave us alone, or we would all go to Mary directly to deal with them. Not an hour later, I'm called out of my science class to go down to Mary's office. She had called all of us girls down. Apparently, the bullies had decided to go to Mary themselves and spin some sob story how we were bullying them, and they had tried to stand up to us, but then we surrounded them and threatened them to keep quiet. Mary had clearly taken their story in, hook, line, and sinker, and she began berating us for bullying those poor girls, and telling us that we should be ashamed of ourselves and we weren't allowed anywhere near them or we'd have our parents called. Mary even said that she was friends with the mother of one of the bullies, and that girl had been teased at her old school and she didn't deserve the same treatment here, so shame on you. She directly asked me what happened during lunch, and clearly she didn't like the truth that I was telling, because she immediately brushed it off and she continued yelling at us, adding that if any of us tried to interrupt her, she would have us expelled. I stayed quiet because I actually didn't want to be expelled and jeopardize my chance of getting into my new school, but I was now fuming with anger. This anger became fury when I noticed that one of the two girls in the clique was smirking at us from behind Mary's back. Once Mary finally let us leave, I went down to the front office to be excused from class for the rest of the day, claiming to be unwell. My mom was called to pick me up, and as soon as I got into the car, I told her everything that happened. I was able to tell her how the meeting in Mary's office went, nearly word for word, emphasizing the fact that she threatened us with expulsion for speaking up. My mom was furious, and she called Mary personally to give her a piece of her mind. I also told my mom the names of all the other girls who had been humiliated along with me, and my mom then called their parents to tell them what happened. Many of them called Mary as well to complain about the injustice done. The next day, I went back to school and I retold the story to all of my classmates who asked where I'd been. This not only turned many of them against the bullies who had orchestrated the entire thing, but also it allowed me to convince them to tell their parents to write letters to the board about Mary's behavior as well. The entire time, I stay away from the clique in class, and whenever a teacher noticed and pulled me aside to ask why I was actively avoiding those girls in particular, I told them that they had been bullying me and that Mary had them protected. I was a very good student, and I had a good relationship with many of my teachers, who would sometimes keep me company during lunch because I didn't have any friends to hang out with. So they believed me and they made their own complaints. When Mary tried to confront me about them, I simply told her that I was just letting my teachers know exactly what she told us, so they couldn't accidentally make us work together. The whole thing caused such a mess for Mary that she was immediately removed as the interim principal, and she lost her position as the board director shortly after that. I went onto my new high school feeling quite smug about that. What a hero OP was for standing up not only for themselves but the others as well. I only wish OP said to Mary, "Sorry for using your own words against you." Gotta love it when people's words come back to bite them in the end, right? Just like this next teacher. So bear with me because there's a lot of backstory here. This happened over a decade ago, so some details are foggy. Going into the senior year of high school, I was at a small rural high school where all the smart kids get sent off to the distance learning building their junior and senior year to take college courses. Junior year, the woman in charge of us in distance learning had been teaching at our school district for 15 plus years. She knew us, our families, taught us in multiple grades, and she coached about 3/4 of us in track or tennis. Keep in mind, our entire student body, kindergarten to grade 12, wouldn't have broken 500 kids, even if they padded the numbers with voluntary pre-K and GED students. This woman knew us, knew our antics, and generally trusted us to get our work done. She made sure that we actually watched our classes and we didn't get into a bind on our assignments. Outside of that, as long as we were doing something productive and we had our main stuff done, our time was our own to use as we saw fit. In my case, it was mostly spent playing guitar and reading up on the playbook for whatever athletic competition I had that week. I was an academically good but insufferably lazy student. That said, summer passes, and the first day of senior year comes around, and the teacher we all adored had moved away. In her place is some tall, red-haired jackass that none of us had ever seen before. Turns out, he's the new head coach for the girls' basketball team and our new distanced learning supervisor. Our college courses didn't start for a couple of weeks, so he spent the entire first day pontificating on how lucky we were to have him, since he had spent the last 10 years in the university world, and he knew how it worked, and he would make sure that we weren't slacking off because we were seniors. The fact that he went from university to high school should have been a red flag to the people that hired him. But whatever. A couple of weeks go by of this coach, who we'll call Bob, making us do pointless practice assignments like writing a paper on respect or researching a new car for his wife while citing our sources. This was all under the guise of making sure we were prepared. The students all politely informed him that these courses were through a community college, and they were generally no more difficult than a normal high school class, except for the STEM courses. Fast forward 2 weeks and the courses start. Finally, we thought. Now, Bob's antics throughout the whole year would have been bearable, had he not made the habit of insulting students who did something that wasn't to his liking, or held a political view contrary to the university culture he came from, which was all of us. He went to demanding that we submit all assignments to him before our actual professors, which he didn't go through quickly, causing many of us to lose points for late assignments. The guy would also berate us, telling us that we were in no way mature enough for this kind of learning, and if it was up to him, he would take our entitled asses right back over to the main building for real classes. The straw that broke the camel's back came at the end of fall semester. We had all taken our finals, and we'd passed, and we were looking forward to an easy few weeks. Bob came in that morning in a worse mood than usual. I found out years later that this was the day his wife divorced him. The guy starts berating one of the girls for how she was dressed. She ignored him, as did the rest of us. We were all just making it through to the end of the semester. Bob then began one of his speeches about how terrible and entitled we all were. Nobody was paying any attention, which made him even more angry. But he knew that he couldn't really punish us for anything. So he zeroes in on that one kid who had been placed in the classroom for remedial learning, as it was a quiet, consistent environment. He was the one student in the room actually working on something. The conversation is paraphrased, as this was well over 10 years ago. It went as follows. Bob says to him, "Hey, so-and-so, what are you doing?" The student somewhat rudely replies to him, "I'm trying to study for my test that's coming up, so I don't get held back." Bob then says, "For what? So you can eventually go flip burgers at the Dairy Queen down the road? Please, you're not gonna get it done anyways, so have some respect and pay attention when I'm speaking." And that was it for me. You see, this student happened to be my cousin, and I was familiar with his academic and personal struggles, and I knew how hard he was working to straighten up. Our family's rather well known and affluent in our community, and my cousin was often regarded as a screw-up by some folks outside our family, despite his overwhelmingly kind disposition. Right now, this stupid teacher was insulting the most vulnerable member of the class and my family. I thought it was time to hurt this guy in the worst way I could think of without hurting myself or getting arrested. You see, my mom had been teaching for 25 years in the district at that point, and my stepfather is a retired guidance counselor, so I knew the rules. I'd previously refrained from honestly discussing his conduct with my parents because Bob's daughter had actually become a part of our friend circle, and I knew how hard life would be on her if Dad lost his job, as his reputation made her life hard enough. Knowing what would happen next, I casually remarked, "Hey Coach Bob, it seems to me that if you knew half as much about basketball as you think you know about so-and-so subject, you'd probably still have your job at this university. Or you would have gotten your contract renewed for another year at the last school board meeting. Where will you go after the school year ends?" The room went dead quiet. That info wasn't in the newspaper yet. Bob's face turns an absolute vibrant shade of red. His voice is shaking as he tells me, "Outside, now." I calmly set down my book and I stepped out into the foyer of the building. Bob follows me out, closes the door, and he proceeds to scream every insult and cuss word he could think of in my face for at least 4 minutes straight. That I was the most smug, lazy, entitled little a-hole he'd ever seen, apparently. That I may have been able to pull the wool over the eyes of my pastor and every teacher, his daughter, and all of my coaches, but gosh darn it, I could never fool him. I was never going anywhere in life, and I was just gonna ride my family name like a parasite. And to be honest, his lung capacity was kind of impressive. I don't think he took a single breath for the entirety of his rant. Once he stopped to catch his breath, I asked, "Coach Bob, can I go back to my reading now?" He then screams in my face, "No, your ass is going straight to the principal and I will write down exactly what you said and you will sign the damn thing. Do you understand?" I respond, "Yes, sir, I'd be happy to sign it." Bob just goes silent and he gives me a questioning gaze. I then go on to say, "I'd be happy to go down to Principal so-and-so. I need to ask him for a letter of recommendation for a scholarship, and of course, he'll ask me what led to me saying something so disrespectful. Of course, I can't lie to him. I'll mention our little chat out here." By this point, the teacher in the other classroom, who I also happened to be related to, came out to see what the commotion was about, who had also heard the tail end of his glorious speech. She was about to say something, but I turn and I give her a smile and a wink. I had it in the bag. 18-year-old me was riding high. Bob sent me back to the distance learning room and followed me in. I just stood by the door awaiting my office referral. A minute goes by and it never came. He then says, "Sit down, Jones." I respond, "Coach Bob, I believe classroom insubordination requires an office referral." He then says, "If that's the way you want to go." Bob's voice starts to raise a bit at this point, but he understood his situation. He wrote up the office referral and I walked happily down to the admin office. The principal was surprised to see me and even more surprised that I was sent there on disciplinary action. I told him what had happened and I got detention for 1 day as punishment for open disrespect of a teacher, which I kind of deserved, and a thank you for my honesty. The next 2 weeks were heavenly. Bob barely spoke a word, and he spent most of his time glaring at me or looking at job listings. At the start of the spring semester, he wasn't in distance learning. In fact, he was nowhere to be seen. Turns out, he'd accepted a last-minute opportunity somewhere else before Christmas break, and he had to move there in time for spring practices to start. What a coincidence. I found out years later that Bob was soon let go from his next coaching job, and he had gotten divorced. The other faculty had apparently repeatedly complained about his conduct, and he was on incredibly thin ice long before my little stunt. Honestly, I feel kind of sorry for the guy after writing this memory down. So my best friend loves every time I tell this story, so I thought I would share it with all of you. In high school, we had this English teacher who was very opinionated in her grading. If she loved a book, the class had to read it, and if you didn't get a good grade on your report when you turned it in. I was an avid reader. In fact, I cleaned out my school library in the 3rd grade, so let's just say I wasn't a fan of her literal selections. She was also the kind of teacher that thought that her class was the most important one you had. Due to this, the workload was quite substantial. Coming up on our final exam, she gave the class a talk 1 week before the final. She said she would be weighing our grade for the semester, giving 60% of it to the final. She explained that she was preparing us for college. However, since she was also giving so much weight to the final, she would give us an opportunity to earn extra credit. For every 4 lines of the poem, the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner you could memorize and write verbatim on the back of the test, you would receive 1 point of extra credit. I had a rough year due to her grading style, so I was getting a B in the class at the time. However, this was my moment to shine. I have a knack for remembering things. In fact, as a freshman, I learned all the lines for the lead role of Neil Simon's Rumors 2 hours before opening night due to a lead dropping out. I then performed the role for 3 nights without dropping a line. So this opportunity seemed made for me, and I wasn't going to let it pass me by. I got home and I looked up the poem. It was well over 400 lines, so I got to work. Then the final exam came. I sat down confidently in my seat and I eagerly waited to receive my test. We receive our 15-page final and we were told we had 3.5 hours to complete it. I put my name at the top and immediately flipped it over to the back. For the next little while, I ravenously wrote out 400 straight lines from the epic poem verbatim. With that step complete, I then decided to look at the questions she intended for us to answer. It was filled with multiple choice, essays, and fill-in-the-blank questions. I took some time to fill in the blanks that I knew and guessed at the multiple choice ones I didn't know, and I completely ignored her biased essays. And now for the fun part. Not even an hour into the 3.5-hour final, I walked triumphantly to the teacher's desk. I flipped the test on her desk and I said, "Have a great summer." To which she said, "Very funny. It's a 3.5-hour final. Sit down and finish your test." To which I respond, "No, I'm finished. I got over 100%. She then says, "Let me see your paper." She then looks through my test and she saw the empty essays and empty fill-in-the-blanks. Now, even more annoyed, she said, "You haven't even answered half of these. It's a 3.5-hour final, so sit down and finish your test." I wouldn't be denied though. I said to her, "No, I'm finished. I got over 100%. Right about now, she's getting very upset, and the color in her face is starting to shift. She looks at me and says, "How do you think you have over 100% when you left so much of this blank? You haven't done half the test." With a big smile, I just said to her, "Look at the back. You said for every 4 lines of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner we memorized and wrote on the back, we would get 1 point of extra credit. You'll have noticed that I wrote out all 400 lines from the poem. By my math, That equals 100% of extra credit. Anything I answered in this nonsense is gravy, so I got over 100%. With that, she turns beet red. Her knuckles were white holding my paper, and she stares at me with hate in her eyes. I just said to her, "Have a great summer." I got an A in the class. My final was 145% out of 100. Listen, who else is surprised that OP's teacher honored that extra credit assignment? Gotta give her props for that, for knowing when she's bested. But yeah, the lesson here is don't mess with students because you never know how far somebody will go to spite you, especially if you're a nasty, nasty teacher. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our /malicious compliance. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy, crazy stories. And if you missed yesterday's episode on the channel, it's an r/entitled people episode where Karens are running psycho on ships. It's such a wild episode, so go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.